Today I'm welcoming Ron Robison, who served for more than 3 decades as the leader of the Young Americans Foundation. And that is the largest advocate group for young people in the United States, conservative young people. It's also helping to identify the future leaders of tomorrow, not only in media, but in political life. Ron, thank you very much for joining us.
Lawrence, it's great to be with you today.
Can you tell us a little bit about your foundation? And you've had a great national meeting here in Florida recently, and you've always brought together leaders there. And not only when you bought the ranch out in California, uh, a lot about what you're doing, and you're very active too. Of course, I should mention to the viewers that Time Magazine has talked about how successful Ron had been in building his organization as one of the best in the country.
Well, it's kind of you to say. The truth is, the credit goes to people like Ronald Reagan, a lot of the young people that we work with around the country. But if I can focus in on our connection with President Reagan, which began in his earliest days as a conservative activist, he was interested in passing his ideas on to young people. And YAF and Young America's Foundation was a natural partner to do that. That is what we specialize in. Most conservatives I know, like yourself, Lawrence, want to help young people come to the right ideas. They would give them an excellent book. They would tell them about a radio or television program or a conference they ought to attend in order to introduce them to the ideas of individual freedom, protecting American traditional values, and American sovereignty. Well, basically, we stand in your stead and do that systematically with young people around the country using great speakers like Ronald Reagan throughout his career. He was very much a partner in doing this. Of course, YAF itself was founded at Bill Buckley's home in Sharon, Connecticut. The original statement of principles was written by Bill Buckley and Stan Evans at the Sharon, Connecticut home of the Buckley family. And then it's down through modern day leaders. In the past year, we've had Governor Scott Walker, we've had Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Ron Johnson, uh, Governor Mike Pence, uh, Senator Rand Paul. These are speakers that have spoken to our young people around the country to introduce them to the ideas of individual freedom.
Well, I think you're making a tremendous contribution to the conservative movement, and also what I really like to think about conservative thinkers, those who are going to set the policy for the future. When we are all at the Department of Education many years ago, and when you think about what Bill Bennett was able to bring together there, not only people like you and Michelle and John Waters and Mark Levin. Most people don't remember that Mark was my deputy over at the Department of Education. Mark now heads up the Landmark Legal Foundation. He also has been one of your speakers, I see, and Charles Greenleaf and all of those folks who that Secretary Bennett brought around that table, who are continuing to make a contribution to the American movement. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about the Reagan Ranch and how that came to pass, that you bought that, and what you do with it in terms of bringing young people together there?
I'd be delighted to, but I do want to thank you for the leadership you showed in seeing someone like Mark Levin, who's really one of the great communicators in our country today, and also working with Secretary Bennett. I really had a very small role in that time period. My wife, Michelle Easton, had a much more significant role in the department and with Secretary Bennett and some of his successors as well. But it was a great crew, and it was the kind of individuals, Lawrence, that you and Secretary Bennett identified as having an important role to play in the country and as reformers in education, as people that could make a dramatic impact in the country today. And Michelle's still very much in education with the Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute. Obviously, Mark Levin is well known to all of us, his great books, as well as his radio program. But just as you identified the up-and-coming talent, and Secretary Bennett did as well, Ronald Reagan really was an expert at doing that. There are a large number of people involved today in public policy on the Supreme Court and elsewhere that cut their teeth in the Reagan Revolution. Well, Ronald Reagan, I think, even though he was the oldest elected president of the United States, was always focused on reaching young people and was very much involved with the EF, really since he joined the Young Americans for Freedom Advisory Board in 1962 and spoke to the first Young Americans Foundation Conference in 1974. And when we look back 15 years ago, in the mid to late 1990s, we thought about the individuals who best personified what we believed in. And there were a lot of great leaders on the national scene at that particular time, but nobody represented our ideas better than Ronald Reagan did as an advocate and then as president of the United States. And when no one else was stepping forward to protect his presidential property, the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara, it was the only part of the Reagan presidency where he physically possessed during his presidential years that could be protected as it was. The White House changes, and Camp David changes, but the only other property he was associated with or owned at that time was Rancho del Cielo in Santa Barbara. And it was going to be lost in terms of protecting that part of American history. So we stepped forward and asked the Reagans if they wanted it protected. They did. And we began a working partnership with the Reagan family that continues to this day. We continue to work with Michael and Ashley, the president's granddaughter, to save and protect the ranch. We took over the ranch 15 years ago in the spring of 1998, beginning that process actually in December of 1997. And in recent years, we've added a center in downtown Santa Barbara that has theater, classrooms, meeting areas, places that really are become a schoolhouse for teaching Reaganism to complement the Reagan Ranch itself.
You know, one of the things we should have mentioned, and our good friend Gary Bauer, who also was at the part of the team that Secretary Bennett had at the Department of Education, and Gary's continuing to make a contribution, and the Weekly Standard, Bill Crystal.
Right.
And so that when you add up those who are leading the conservative movement to today, many of them had their opportunities to begin their work in the conservative movement. Really, were working for Secretary Bennett, who's continuing to make a tremendous contribution too, and to the whole thing. So when you begin to look, though, as you're bringing these young people together in seminars and involvement on the college campuses, how do you go about that?
Well, you know, there is a hunger for new ideas that college students have. In too many of our educational institutions today, they want to teach them what to think, of leftist orthodoxy, rather than how to think or even to think for themselves. And there's a dearth of ideas of individual freedom, of traditional values, the kind of ideas that Secretary Bennett and Ronald Reagan has spent their lifetimes, their careers advancing. So students don't get that in the classroom in too many cases. And they need to supplement their education with some other outside influences, and they can do that a number of ways. But Young Americans Foundation tries to recruit them for a series of educational programs that we hold, conferences, lectures on the college campus. It's been a long tradition in American collegiate life to have guest lecturers. Young Americans Foundation sponsors over 600 guest lectures on the college campuses a year. Last year, we held more than a dozen conferences and major seminars at the Reagan Ranch and throughout the country. To give you just one idea of the type of programs that we have a week-long conference in Washington. Secretary Bennett, through the years, has participated in that. Ronald Reagan has as well. Well, it's roughly about 35 separate speakers. In the last year, we had Rick Santorum, we had Newt Gingrich, we had Governor Walker speak, we had Senator Rand Paul, we had Senator Ron Johnson, we had a series of congressmen, Jim Jordan, Alan West, Michelle Bachmann. We had some world-class faculty members, Walter Williams, Harvey Mansfield, Bert Folsom. These were among some of the speakers there, and then some great commentators, individuals like Jonah Goldberg would be certainly a leading list. Peter Schweitzer, who also serves on our board, is another good example of an independent commentator like that. Steve Moore of the Wall Street Journal. So students hear about these programs, we promote them. It's their opportunity to hear more outstanding, freedom-oriented, conservative speakers in 1 week at a Young America's Foundation conference. They're going to have the opportunity to hear in 4 years at any undergraduate education anywhere else in the country. Even the most so-called conservative schools don't put a lineup like that together in such a succinct period of time. Our last conference that we just completed last month following the November elections featured Senator-elect Ted Cruz from Texas, included Congressman Jamie Herrera Butler, the youngest woman in Congress, but she's beginning to serve now her second term in Congress, but a brilliant, articulate, young Hispanic woman that came out of our programs. And we also heard from Senator Ron Johnson up until he was elected 2 years ago, a businessman in Wisconsin. So these programs are the type of free enterprise oriented, individual freedom, traditional American values, intellectual material that is oftentimes not adequately covered on the college campuses. And students seem eager to come to these conferences and to also to watch them on the web or to participate in some other way in our programs.
Well, you had at one of your conferences, when I heard you give those lists of speakers, one is Congressman West. The congressman has represented Harris in Florida very well. He was recently defeated in a very close race, but I'm sure that Alan West is going to be heard from again. As you know,
Absolutely.
Mark's had him on his show an awful lot, and I'm hoping that Congressman will be on my show no matter how long it takes me to get him. He is one of the tremendous fighters in the conservative movement today, and I'm hoping that the good governor from South Carolina and her wisdom puts together. Of course, I have a candidate for that Senate seat like everybody else, but I'm hoping that Congressman Scott, that they make history there in appointing a true conservative to replace a true conservative. And that we'll know pretty soon. She says she's not going to take a long time with that, and I hope that that she made history as the first governor, that she would also make history as the first U.S. senator from the great state of South Carolina. And even though everybody doesn't know what their song is, and I couldn't remember it either, you know, and I've been there a lot of times, but Governor Haley's done a tremendous job, and I think that when we I'm hoping though, and of course, you know, I don't get a vote in South Carolina, but God, I'd like to see Senator Scott.
Right, I can understand that. He served his constituents well in the House of Representatives. I'm sure he would serve the state of South Carolina very well. With Alan West, we're going to continue to hear Alan West. I think that from him, and he still has a very bright future in our country. He served in the U.S. military with distinction. You know, he obviously showed he's the type of battlefield leader that if you were a soldier or your son or daughter was in the field, you'd want Alan West as the commanding officer. And he's the type of person that it's interesting how the left talks about conservatives, and sometimes they'll say the Republican Party doesn't have enough minorities. They go absolutely out of their way and pour every last resource they have to defeat every minority that gets involved in the Republican Party. So we really see the hypocrisy of the left when they attack someone as viciously as they attacked Alan West, and make a top priority to try to keep all the minorities in you know, in a one narrow ideological perspective on Capitol Hill. I don't think that's possible long term, but it was a very a nasty and dirty campaign they ran against Alan West. Whether, you know, he even had a fair counting of the vote at the end is very much subject to doubt, but he handled that with the type of class that he's handled his entire career.
He has, and he's going to be missed in Congress, but he won't be missed from the national stage. This man has a story to tell, and if you ever, well, you've heard him speak, but all the viewers may not have heard Alan West speak, but he is just a tremendous patriot, and he is one of those that when faced with what he was faced with in the overseas, and if he could save American lives, um, I think I might have done a little bit more than he did.
Well,
But
as I said, he's the kind of person you'd want to be your commanding officer because you
you
knew he
follow
would
that guy.
everything to protect you.
And what we need to do is find more leaders, like Alan West and others who will carry the message forward. Because as I always say, I do a little bit tells of the day, and one of the things I point out that is everybody wants to talk about Ronald Reagan, but they don't want to be like Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese and Mike Deaver and all of them made tough decisions, but you always knew that there was an interest of the country. And that's what we have to be, and that's true conservatism, is putting America first. And until we get back to that, Ron, we're going to have continuous trouble. We lost our compass, our moral compass, and we need to find that again, and have a rebirth of America. And
right, I think
because
you capture
I was
something
reading an
very
article the other
important.
day, Ron, that points out, and I didn't mean to step on what you were going to say, but they're talking about America becoming a second economic power to China. That ought to burn into everybody's soul a little bit. And that's only because we're letting it be, and that, we're going to be, of course, they're predicting that we'll be energy independent, but we're not, but we're going to lose that economic power unless we go ahead and do what the Secretary Bennett was talking about, reverting this whole thing for education, and the same thing that President Bush 43 was talking about, in terms of No Child Left Behind. We have to upgrade our educational system. And contrary to what some of the unions are talking about, we have to allow people to teach people what's right and wrong, because they took that out of schools. They said we're teaching morals. Well, we were born as a country based upon really this whole 10 Commandments. And I don't want to get all, people get all emotional about it, but if we were built on this is how our subject of law came from, then how can you teach somebody in school without teaching them right and wrong?
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. The moral compass is missing in a lot of our political leaders today. It's missing in the educational system. And referencing the 10 Commandments is a great example. If they could get away with it, they would just say, this is something handed down by a dead, white male, handing it down to us. But it has been the foundation not only of both major religions. Normally, you think of in the United States Judeo-Christian heritage, but also even other faiths. Muslim faith certainly recognizes Moses' role in the 10 Commandments. There's a case where if you understand and appreciate the 10 Commandments, you do have a moral compass. But with moral relativism today taught almost universally in the schools that do what is right and wrong, that is when society begins to become unhinged. And I think that was very much understood by Secretary Bennett. I think understood by Ronald Reagan. I think that Secretary Bennett's contribution in the cabinet was tremendous. He also was with his book or books, but starting certainly with the Book of Virtues, which could be used as a textbook at any level today of teaching fundamental values. You know better than I, Lawrence, that in fact values are taught on the college campuses and in the high school and elementary schools. There's not a school in this country today that I've been on a campus in recent years that doesn't teach them basically a version, usually a leftist version, of environmentalism. Every school has their recycling bin and there are recycling rules, and you can argue for or against it. But the schools have values. It's just that they wanted to take out the traditional time-tested values and substitute them for a modern version of that. And whether that's working out for the country today, whether it's working out for the average American family, is very much in question.
I agree with you, Ron, and I think we need to be able to talk about subjects without being politically correct. Because what people get confused about, and I'll give you one of my pet peeves, and whenever we talk about illegal aliens, people want to call them undocumented. Well, you're illegal, and so you get censored for that, for using the word illegal rather than undocumented. And you say to people, why don't, if they ever want to see some immigration laws for illegals, go to Mexico. Mexico has some very tough for illegals. But you're not just talking about Mexico, and that's what people try to get you centered on. You're really talking about one of our biggest borders that is unprotected is really Canada. And so that you have the Canadian border running all the way down to Mexico that you want to be protected. So when you talk about protecting your borders, it's not just Mexico. It's really right now in some parts of Canada, you can to get to the United States, you can walk across or go through the forest and come into the United States. Well, when you're talking about border protection, it's really more than Mexico, but yet we get all centered on Mexico because that's the way they direct you, so they can say that you're not being sensitive when you're talking about Mexico. But we're talking about border protection wherever we have open borders, and we are not able to really address the issues of the medical costs, the educational costs, and how many countries, if you go to France and you want to get a driver's license and you are from the United States, they don't put the test in English. But if we talk about that kind of thing in this country, they say that you're not being politically correct, you're being insensitive, and God forbid they use that you are a racist. But we know that, I'm from a large family, 14, counting mom and dad. And my dad and mother knew that education had to learn it in order to be successful. And so that there's nothing wrong with people learning English, and we that should be a value, and that's what makes the difference between the early immigrants into the country and those who fail to learn that are not able to move up the system, and not able to get the better jobs. And we ought to be wanting people to learn English so they can get the better jobs, so they can make more contribution to their family. There's nothing wrong with that, but if we go to talk about it, and we all of a sudden get this tag, and I use that word, I don't like to use the word loosely, but all of a sudden you become a racist, and rather than saying we come to America to become Americanized, in order to be part of the American fabric, and we ought to then be able to teach people and the history of America, what they used to do in the old citizenship classes, and that you have to learn English and go through. And I'm hoping that reasonable people will sit down and come up with a reasonable proposal without calling each other names, that we're being, and I don't care in the end if they call it undocumented or illegal, but but what I'm pointing out is that we need to get down and really get down to the point of how do we help people become part of the American fabric, and who are not going to go home, they're not going to self-deport. But how do we go about then helping them become successful, that they learn English and are able to support their families, just like I want to be able to support mine.
One of the reasons the United States has been the choice of immigrants throughout modern times, but also throughout our history, is because we have had the rule of law in this country. We have had protection of individual freedom, which includes the freedom to use your own income and others that you've earned largely as you choose to do. That is why the United States has been so attractive to immigrants from throughout the world, from the very earliest days of the United States. So we have no apologies for following the rule of law and being simultaneously a pro-immigration country. But if you throw out the rule of law and you suddenly make us, just an attractive welfare state, the very reasons immigrants come to this country in the first place will be destroyed. And so again, that comes back to traditional American values. Families in this country came from all over the world, but they didn't come for a handout. They didn't come by the very first act of violating the laws of this land. And there has to be a balance. You hit a key point that's still a major issue of contention on the college campuses. There are a lot of programs justified that are horrific programs with very, very bad results purportedly to fight racism. We have that with the affirmative action program on the college campus today, which is a race admissions program. And those schools that have had those programs that have been decided by the left for the longest period of time have the worst race relations in the country. They have the most need for some sort of new reforms. So that it's an example of using the term that you said, by accusing somebody of racism, bringing about faulty policies that only exacerbate whatever problems that previously existed in our society. So you're quite right to say that that is part of the way in which this problem got out of hand. Immigrants come to this country historically because we followed the rule of law. People in this country, if they earned an honest living, could decide how it was going to be spent. They didn't have to go to a government bureaucrat to get permission to spend it the way they wanted to spend it. That's what has made America so attractive historically, and that's what has to be protected.
Well, I'm hoping that Senator Rubio in his proposals on immigration, which people keep saying he's going to introduce in the next session of Congress, I hope that's true, that we began an intelligent discussion on this subject without the name calling, and that we began to look at how we are going to help them become part of America. And then we move forward from there. But I also keep in mind when our former boss was the drug czar, he was very strong on that we had to have our borders secured. And Ronald Reagan talked about our borders being secure. So the first step of that, I believe, is securing our borders. The second step is what do you do about undocumented or illegal aliens, whatever you want to call them, who are in the country. And then how do we take those students, for example, we're a shortage in math and science and engineering, and we have people graduating from our universities with PhDs and who could, in computer technology and other fields that could aid America. And I think we need to have a quick path for them to be able to work in the country. I don't know why we would want to send them back, after spending, because the government subsidizes university education in this country, public education in this country, and we ought to be able to use those resources to turn around our economic system, and so that everybody becomes part of this economic engine, which is America, and we move our negative deficit, in terms of import and exporting to a positive by having a lot of our people be able to start own businesses in this country, contribute to other companies. Who's going to be the next Microsoft or Google? And we have them within our system today if we just take advantage of what we have and recognizing and have an intellectual discussion, which universities are supposed to be able to have. And we look at the outcome. What's going to be the outcome that we want to be in terms of, remember when Nancy Reagan, I was over at Action at the time as associate director there, and we came up with an idea of just say no, and working with Mike Deaver and their staff, and the first lady accepted that as no, just say no. And people say it's not going to work. They were wrong. There was a lot of things work if people would start looking and saying, for example, I'd like to have the young man or woman who comes into this country who came with their parents who were illegal. I'd like to see some way that we are helping to them become American, and I don't think there is, but that doesn't mean I want to have somebody who is 16 years old to get a license to drive who's not an American citizen. But that doesn't mean that I'm against Hispanics or or somebody else when I say that, because like there's insurance requirements and everything else that goes along with that. And as you go on an airline, you find that you have to give some kind of government ID. No, I don't know what that driver's license for somebody who's undocumented who I can't verify their past record in whatever country they're from is going to mean. And but then again, I don't want to get off on that too much, Ron, because somebody will be writing me an email saying I'm a racist. Even though I was part of the movement out there and coordinating councils and everything else, and NAACP and Urban League board chairman. But I think all I'm saying is let's have an intellectual discussion about it and come up with the right solution for this country. And so that we can then set the whole productive engine of this country apart, and so that we just don't keep dividing people, that we keep looking at, because all of these people, if you looked at me growing up in my little small town, 14 people in the house. My dad was a factory worker. My mother went to work at the Capitol as a matron. You know, and then to find out that I've been able to work at the highest level in Washington D.C. for presidents and so on, and I've had two brother and a sister who are law grads from the University of Michigan and a bunch of other masters in ED. I want people to have the same dream I was able to do. Not that they want to be to work for a president of the United States or something, but whatever that dream is, I want them to be able to live that dream. And I happen to believe that the conservative principles will help them get there. Because we see people as people. We don't categorize you, and we don't change our philosophy to try to win your vote. You know, and I think that's the way that's going to be the future. Ronald Reagan said a lot of things, but he also said that I think very importantly is that as long as you don't worry about who gets the credit for it, you can accomplish a lot.
Right.
You remember that?
No, I think you're right on target there. I think the idea of passing on the freedoms that has meant so much to all of us, that could allow a family of 12 children to prosper in that way, is partly because families were left with the resources to make those decisions for themselves and to allocate their resources, the resources they earn, and not be beholden to government, not have to go to Washington or a state capital to lobby to get back their resources. So the amount that government is eating up and is threatening today is so great. It puts families of that size in jeopardy in the future. They can allocate the resources as they choose rather than as a government bureaucrat or a politician chooses to do for them. And that is a big part of the modern day conservative community. It's not that we're just for low taxes because we're somehow going to pocket this money. We take the money that we've earned and we invest it in our children's education. We invest it in our children's health care. We invested in our children's careers. And those are decisions that are best made locally. Ronald Reagan frequently said, the person who earns the wage should be the first person to say how that ought to be used. They will make better decisions than a bureaucrat in Washington. Even smart bureaucrats, if you want to put it that way, that may do well in their own life, but they won't make the best decisions for some individual out in elsewhere in the country. And so Ronald Reagan would say the person who earned it should have the biggest say. They'll do a better job than someone in Washington. Therefore, we're for lower taxes. Therefore, we're limiting the role and scope of government. Lawrence, one of the big changes in the past 20, 30 years is how much more government has decided they have to decide for us. That has made everything much more contentious. The classic example is taking over healthcare. The law books are filled with families fighting over the healthcare of aging parents or grandparents. What is the best way to allocate those resources? What type of attention they ought to be given at the end of their life? If all those decisions have to be made by going to your congressman, to your senator, to someone in a committee in Washington or a review board, everything that we've disagreed about relating to Washington in our general society in the past 10 or 15 years is going to explode and be much worse, so much more exacerbated in the years to come.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the concept of limited government, the limited government and maximum individual freedom that led the people to come to the United States, that drove the ideas of Ronald Reagan and Bill Bennett. Let Americans decide for themselves. Let's keep what government's doing to the absolute minimum. If we do that, I think there's a bright future for our country. The further we move away from that, the more endangered our liberties become and the less civil our society will be.
Well, let's set the American free, and allow America to explore in many different flowers grow. I think that we could do that. And if we do this in a systematic way, from improving our education, first of all, I want to make sure I say that, because you cannot really be successful without a good education in America. And so we've got to make sure. I'm tired of hearing about Scandinavian countries being the best in the world. I think it's time for America to find out why we're not using the technology and everything that we know about how to teach people to read and do math, and start using it, whatever roadblocks they are, because it's more than the teacher in the classroom. It's really the principal and the superintendents and the school boards who are failing their job. And the answer is not just going to be creating all charter schools, because some charter schools are good and some are bad. But what I like to see is come up with a scoreboard every year. And remember back in some of the major corporations used to have an 80-20 rule. About 20% of the employees that didn't make those measurements every year, they were gone. So maybe that we need to do in education, that instead of giving a school 3 years to turn itself around, maybe we need to have every year we get the worst teachers and the worst principals and out of the system. I know that would be very controversial, but instead of the schools need to be created for kids, not for the professionals.
Well, Secretary Bennett had a formula for this that I'm sure you recall. You probably were involved in formulating. But he said if there was a burger place anywhere in the country serving a bad burger, it would go out of business pretty quickly because there's a lot of competition there. In education, we put up with a lot of underachievement. It would be the equivalent of a place putting out bad burgers, just hoping that it somehow will be reformed or somehow they'll come to a better idea without competition forcing them to come up with and being willing to move on. I think when that approach that the Secretary taught is important. I think parental involvement is important. When you push the parents and the family further away from being involved in their own child's education and put it in the hands of more so-called specialists, but push parents away, make it more difficult for parents to have a say, I think that you're going to have less family involvement in raising their own children and making educational choices. I would venture a guess, Lawrence, that your parents were very active in the education of your 12 or your 11 siblings and yourself, probably far more than a parent today who might have one or two children, but because experts in the school system decide everything, and it's so difficult to make any changes in their education, they don't do it. My wife, as you know, was very much involved with the Department of Education. She eventually became the president of Virginia's Board of Education. When we tried to have some input into where our children were going to be placed in the local government school system, here in Reston, Virginia, we have 9 public schools. And even within the 9, we have some different teachers for the same grade level. We could not decide, even at one school, we could not decide among the 9, which we easily could have gotten our children to. And even in the one, Forest Edge, when my first son went there, it was a school with no walls, very experimental. We went, met the teachers that he was going to have. My wife was still pleased with the teachers there, but the first day of school for my oldest son, RJ, they switched the teacher. That type of educational approach and policies discouraging parents that were as active as Michelle and I were over our own children's education is very discouraging and what drives the average parent to throw up their hands. So there has to be more student and parent involvement and less control by the unions, less control by a series of rigid government controls that our educational system has put in place.
Well, I agree with you. I had two of my kids went to South Lakes there in Ruston and received a very good education. One graduating from Penn State University and the other graduating from the University of California, but in a Russian major. But I think part of what someone asked me one day what I thought was wrong with education, I said, well, one of my kids had an algebra teacher, and this was in Fairfax, and the end result was the algebra teacher told him that they could not ask the question if they didn't know what they did wrong. And so I went up to see her. You know, I was assistant secretary of elementary and secondary education. I thought I would find out what educational philosophy, what research she, because I told her in the end, I said, if he knew what he did wrong, he didn't need you. He obviously thought the way he went about the proposal was correct. And so we ended up getting him a tutor, but a lot of people are not able to afford the tutor, you know, for their son or daughter who's not doing what the teacher wanted in the classroom. But I think if we open it up, and I'm talking about getting teachers involved in this process too, you know, Michelle Yee, who is the former chancellor in DC schools with her student first, has, I think, the right idea to in order to get make sure that the student is number one on our list and build the educational system around that. Ron, I don't know if you know, when I was chairman of the President's Council underneath Nixon in terms of on vocational education, we issued a report, and Marv Feldman, who you may have heard of, Marv was later on the Financial Institute of Technology president, and he was out of the OEO program, and part of what we put out in that proposal, and this is before the Commission Nation at Risk came out, we did a report and what we said that if our public schools was a corporation, we would have closed them down as bankrupt.
Right.
The Commission Nation at Risk came out and said if an enemy had tried to impose this kind of educational system on it, we would declare it as an act of war. But we're still just making incremental changes. And I think one of the things is, you know, of course, I don't know if parents could do as my parents would discipline me when I didn't behave correctly at my little Catholic school. You know, I don't know if they could do that today. There was a talking, and then you got a little spanking, you know, inside. And those things are, people today are putting their kids in corners and counting 1, 2, 3. My dad didn't count. But the end result is that my mother was very involved in my process and making sure I did my homework and that I was successful. My dad, all he wanted to do was to see my report card. And I tell my students a story about when I took a guy's class in geography, and because why do they take geography? I'm sitting in the student union and people say, you want an easy 2 credit, take geography. And so I get in this class with a guy by the name of Perry Bailey, who becomes one of my best teachers, and I always remember his name. And they tell you that you don't have to go to class every day, you know, and so when you get to college, so I skipped class, and in my house there was one phone. And my dad answered the phone when he was home. And so I skipped Dr. Barry Bailey's class, and we used to call him Commodore Perry, and that's why I always and I skipped his class, and I got a call. And my dad wasn't home yet. It was about 3 something. He's normally walking in the door from the factory. And I picked the phone up, and he says, can I speak to Larry Davenport? And I said, yeah, me. I'm very proud of that. He said, well, this is Dr. Bailey. You missed class today. Now, I thought differently than kids think today. The first thing I thought, what if my dad had answered that call? Mm-hmm. Now, even though I was paying my own way to school, I knew that I was going to have a talking to. that was going to come to me if I missed the class. So I never missed Commodore Perry's class again. And I ended up taking economic geography from him and political geography and all this other. And I always told him before many years ago, I told him this, that he was really responsible for me being able to break the ice with my wife, who I've been now married for over 45 years. And he said, "What was that?" I said, she's from Anaconda, Montana. And when she told me that I didn't know anything about Anaconda, Montana, I could say, "Yes, I do. It has the largest smokestack in the world." And I learned that in economic geography. And he just laughed. But we need more teachers like Dr. Bailey, who inspired you to learn and cared if I was in his class. And because what he wanted to know, if there was some way he'd get my homework to me from that class I missed. But we don't have enough of them. And we need more of people who really want to make sure that you learn, Ron. And then we need more parents. I always credit my mother, even though in a book I wrote about the defining moments about my dad. But my mother was the one that did the nice talk to you, and then she would bring in the enforcer if that didn't work. And I think we need more people who are involving the church. My ministers were involved. I was Catholic, so the priests were involved, and everything else to help me become successful. And that's what, and I mean that also for those who are immigrants to the country, that we have to help them become part of the American fabric. And I mean that totally. And what citizenship means, the responsibility of citizens. And we need to have also the young people today who were born in this country who are not voting, who are sitting at home on election day, not knowing that's part of what it means to be an American. We need to somehow push them forward and say this is what it means to be an American, and we be very proud of that. And rather say, and what we refuse to do is to tell people what it means to be an American. And I don't think we ought to be ashamed of that. We ought to be telling them these are things that we expect of you as an American. I'm talking about people who are born in this country, and quit somehow, what I want to say, dance around it. I'm very proud that I had an opportunity to work for Ronald Reagan. I'm very proud of the people that I met there, from Ed Meese and Reynolds, who was Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. I don't know if you remember Clarence Pendleton, who was the chairman of the Human Rights Commission, Civil Rights Commission, and Penny. I was Penny's boss in San Diego. I was chairman of the Urban League there in San Diego. But when you look at all of these people, and say, well, how do you get to where you are? And that's what I love about what your organization does, is helping young people get to the next level, that they're getting that step up. And we need more of that, Ron, and we need more organizations like yours, and we need more people like you, and who are making a contribution, who are carrying on the Reagan legacy too. I was watching a show the other day, and they said, well, there's no real Reagan legacy, when they were talking about and then I said, where are these guys looking? And don't get me wrong, I love Newt, but they said that the guy who's had more impact on all this thing is Newt's legacy, because he had been involved with Clinton and all the others. But I said that, no, they're missing a point. The legacy was really by Ronald Reagan. That's why everybody keeps trying to be Ronald Reagan, but they're also being Ronald Reagan light, not Ronald Reagan the original. Because in my mind, there will never be another Ronald Reagan. And if I could do anything about it, I'd be up there chiseling a rock up there to try to put his face on Mount Rushmore. Ron, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. And I'm always good to see you. You look great.
It's good to be with you, Lawrence. Appreciate all that you've accomplished, your own legacy, and look forward to working with you again in the days ahead.
I look forward to it, and tell Michelle I'm going to be giving her a call to get on my show.